At 6, the Prime Minister has denied categorically that he was warned a garden party in Downing Street during lockdown was against the rules. During a visit to a London hospital today, Boris Johnson rejected allegations by his former top advisor, Dominic Cummings, that he had lied to Parliament.
I'm absolutely categorical about this. Nobody said to me, this is an event that is against the rules, that is in breach of what we're asking everybody else to do, should not go ahead.
Also on the programme tonight, the Health Secretary Sajid Javid says he is cautiously optimistic that COVID restrictions in England can be substantially reduced next week. Hundreds line the streets in Ireland for the funeral of 23-year-old Aisling Murphy, killed while running in broad daylight, as police say a man has been arrested. The video games company that makes Call of Duty and Candy Crush is making history as it's bought by Microsoft for more than £50 billion.
Brilliant way to finish.
And a stunning start for Britain's Emma Raducanu at her first Australian Open.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, Chelsea look to move back up to second in the Premier League later. They're at Brighton on a night where COVID again affects the fixture list.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Prime Minister has categorically denied being warned that a drinks party in the Downing Street garden during the first lockdown in May 2020 was against the COVID rules. His former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, has said he raised concerns with Boris Johnson at the time and has now accused him of misleading MPs. Today, Mr Johnson again apologised for misjudgments after days of criticism. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young.
Prime Ministers are surrounded by people offering advice. But in the end, they have to use their own judgment. Boris Johnson has admitted joining colleagues for drinks in the garden when the country was locked down, something he now regrets.
I carry full responsibility for what took place, but nobody told me, I'm absolutely categorical about this, nobody said to me, this is an event that is against the rules.
And what about staff partying into the early hours the night before Prince Philip's funeral?
Was having to apologise to the Queen about those parties the night before she put her husband of over 70 years, she laid him to rest. Was that a moment of shame for you?
I deeply and bitterly regret that happened, and I can only and renew my apologies both to Her Majesty and to the country for misjudgments that were made and for which I take full responsibility.
Mr Johnson wasn't there on that occasion, but questions remain about the drinks he did attend. He insists he thought it was a work event.
Morning.
But Dominic Cummings, his former top advisor who's turned against him since leaving the job, says he warned him it was a party and he needed to grip this madhouse. Not for the first time, there are conflicting accounts of what went on here in Downing Street during the pandemic. The senior official, Sue Gray, is investigating and will, of course, be looking for written evidence. But for now, the Prime Minister's approach is to apologise at every opportunity, admit misjudgments and hope that people believe him. For now, support among senior ministers is holding up.
I was getting us out of the pandemic faster than any other country as a hero.
He's a hero, according to the man in charge of party discipline.
Got to split the difference.
And answering questions on all this for the first time was the Chancellor, the man many MPs think could succeed Mr Johnson.
Do you believe the Prime Minister?
Of course I do. The Prime Minister
set out the truth.
Of course I do. The Prime Minister set out his understanding of this matter in Parliament last week, and I'd refer you to his words. As you know, Sue Gray is conducting an inquiry into this matter, and I fully support the Prime Minister's request for patience while that inquiry concludes.
But others are going public with their concerns. Junior Health Minister Maria Caulfield is the latest to post online, saying she was very angry. It is clear, she says, that there was a culture inside Number 10 where even if rules were not technically broken, the spirit of the rules were, and this is completely unacceptable. This evening, the Prime Minister was spotted returning to the Commons. Just 6 Conservative MPs have publicly expressed no confidence in him, but that certainly doesn't tell the whole story. And what's been going on in private, I think, will be more of a worry for the Prime Minister. Groups of MPs meeting all the time to discuss the situation, and a particular emphasis today on some of those who were elected in 2019. They've told the BBC that the mood is hardening against Boris Johnson, and some of them might be prepared to submit letters calling for a vote of confidence in him tomorrow. Now, of course, that would be very bad news for the Prime Minister. This is a secret process, so remember, these kind of threats don't always materialise. One Cabinet Minister said tonight it's going to be bumpy, but we will get through it.
Vicky Young, thank you. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid says he is cautiously optimistic that the current Plan B measures in England can be substantially reduced next week. He says it's likely that the UK has reached the peak of the Omicron wave of infections. The current measures, including mandatory face masks on public transport and advice to work from home, are in force until the 26th of January. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes reports.
Let's come in, follow it round, just into lane 1 here.
In Blackburn, a part of the country still seeing very high COVID infection rates, the push on vaccinations continues. Some families have come for a first or second dose, but today Jeff and Tracy are getting their boosters.
We planned it to come down and it's just been smooth, easy, brilliant, super.
I work with young children who ultimately carry everything, so I want to make sure I'm protecting those children as well. So it's a sacrifice you've got to make. Just get on and do it, get it over with, move on.
Blackburn has some of the lowest vaccination rates in the country. Only around 60% of adults have received their third booster jab. So they put in place drive-through centres like this one just to make it as easy and as accessible as possible to try and bring those vaccination rates up. COVID restrictions in Scotland will be relaxed from Monday. England looks likely to follow suit. But in regions like the north of England, it feels like the pandemic is still in full swing. And health experts are cautious when it comes to thinking about the beginning of the end of the pandemic.
It may be wiser to think about this as the end of the beginning of a long road that we have ahead in recovering.
Because it's going to be with us for a long time.
I think it's the truth that COVID is not going to disappear. We're not going to completely eliminate COVID from our communities. It's more of how we support our communities and how we protect our economy whilst learning to live with COVID.
Nationally, hospital admissions are flat or falling and cases are plummeting. It does feel like things are moving in the right direction. But that UK-wide picture can mask what is happening in particular areas of the country. So in regions like the northwest of England, leaders say it's important to get the right message across.
People will hear pandemic is over. Yes, of course, we can be glad that we're moving in a better direction. But there will still be a need for sensible measures.
Slightly higher on your sleeve then.
We're not yet finished with COVID, but we are perhaps moving towards a world where the virus becomes less of an immediate threat. Managing that transition will be the next challenge. Dominic Hughes, BBC News, Blackburn.
COVID restrictions put in place in Scotland before Christmas will be dropped from next Monday. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says Scotland has turned a corner with Omicron, with cases falling. Our correspondent Lorna Gordon is in Glasgow with the latest for us. Lorna.
Yeah, Sophie, the First Minister said that the rise in cases here in Scotland driven by the Omicron variant peaked in the first week of January. And while we haven't yet moved from the epidemic to the endemic stage of COVID, she was hopeful for a calmer phase going forward. So from the beginning of next week, most restrictions here in Scotland will be dropped. Nightclubs can reopen, large indoor events can resume, social distancing rules are being dropped. Guidance against adults meeting with more than 3 households at a time is also being scrapped, along with curbs on indoor contact sports. Some restrictions remain. People are being asked to work from home where possible, and that longer running measure to wear face masks in public places and on public transport does remain in force, as does the COVID vaccination passport scheme. Business groups have broadly welcomed the changes, as have political opposition parties here in Scotland, although the Scottish Conservatives are calling for that vaccine passport scheme to be dropped entirely, while Scottish Labour says that the Scottish Government must go further in getting promised financial support to businesses here.
Lorna, thank you. The latest government figures show that new infections keep falling. There were 94,432 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. On average, just over 96,000 new cases were reported per day in the last week. The number of people in hospital remains steady, 19,500 yesterday. There's been a big jump in daily deaths recorded, 438 in the latest 24-hour period, although Tuesdays often do see a spike in the numbers. On average, in the past week, 272 deaths were announced every day. On vaccinations, over 36.5 million people have had a booster jab, which means 63.6% of people aged 12 and over have now had 3 vaccine doses. A man in his 30s has been arrested in Ireland on suspicion of the murder of primary school teacher Aisling Murphy. The 23-year-old was killed last week while out running in broad daylight. Today, hundreds of people lined the streets of County Offaly to pay their respects as her funeral took place. From there, Emma Vardy reports.
Sadness has engulfed this town over Aisling Murphy's killing. Today, they stood together in despair and grief, struggling to understand. Pupils from Aisling Murphy's primary school class formed a guard of honour as their teacher's coffin passed by. I have called you each by name. Come and follow me. I will bring you home. Musicians and her teammates paid tribute. Aisling Murphy was a talented violinist and played the Gaelic sport of camogie.
Aisling epitomised the beauty of life and shared her passion, gifts and talents with others so generously. We pray for her friends, colleagues and students in Ballyboy-Keoltis, Kilcormac Cloic Mogi Club and Neve Columcilla Dura.
The circumstances of her death have led to an outpouring of sympathy around the world. She was attacked and killed in broad daylight while out jogging on this canal path. This afternoon, Irish police arrested a man on suspicion of murder. Among those who came to offer their sympathies to Aisling's family was Ireland's Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, whose government are now intending to publish a new strategy on gender-based violence.
The crime, I think, has also asked questions of ourselves and of our society. It has questioned our attitudes, and particularly our attitudes towards women.
Mourners in Tullamore have been joined by thousands around the world who've held vigils in recent days, but her loss will be felt most deeply here. This is a community still in shock that has come together to grieve today. But more widely, Aisling's death has led to calls for this to be a watershed moment in ending violence against women. Aisling's sister Amy described her today as the light of their lives, cut short by a brutal act. Emma Vardy, BBC News, Tullamore.
It's emerged that a man from Blackburn who took 4 people hostage at a synagogue in Texas was known to the security service MI5. Malik Faisal Akram, who was shot dead by police, was no longer thought to be a risk when he travelled to the US late last month. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner is with me. So could this attack have been prevented?
Well, Sophie, there are a number of questions raised by this attack, which has been branded by the Foreign Secretary here as an anti-Semitic attack because it targeted a Jewish synagogue in Texas, and it's been branded a terrorist attack by President Joe Biden. I think, yes, the question is, could it have been prevented? Because he was on a watch list, or at least he was subject to a short 4-week investigation in the latter part of 2020. At the end of that, it was decided that he didn't present a serious risk to the public, and he was put onto a kind of sort of secondary list, as it were, of former subjects of interest. Now, there are up to 40, or in fact, over 40,000 individuals on that list. They didn't pick up anything between the end of 2020 and the end of last year when he flew. The second question is, how was somebody who had a criminal record, because he did, who had displayed erratic and bad-tempered behaviour, been banned from courts, he'd been involved in a drugs transaction, how did somebody like that get to the United States through immigration, spend 2 weeks there, buy a weapon and carry out this attack? So there's a lot of questions to follow up there.
Frank Gardner, thank you. The technology giant Microsoft says it will buy the company that makes video games like Call of Duty and Candy Crush for more than £50 billion. It will be the largest deal in gaming history. The company, called Activision Blizzard, has seen business soar during lockdown, with millions around the world turning to gaming to relieve the boredom. Here's our gaming reporter, Stefan Powell.
Call of Duty, a multiplayer war game. It's one of the biggest and most profitable entertainment franchises in the world. Made by US company Activision Blizzard, a studio which has 400 million people playing every month in 190 countries. And that kind of young fan base is one of the reasons that Microsoft, now itself a veteran tech firm, have swooped, paying over £50 billion for the company, the largest acquisition in gaming history. But why?
More and more companies are looking at ways to either break into or expand their gaming strategies. Even Netflix is doing the same thing, where they've launched a gaming footprint specifically around mobile games.
Activision Blizzard has been at the centre of a storm after employees walked out in protest after numerous sexual harassment, discrimination claims and an allegedly toxic environment. The company's CEO apologised and took a pay cut. But what does this mean for gamers? At the moment, Microsoft's Xbox consoles are lagging behind Sony's PlayStation 5 in terms of sales. By buying Call of Duty and the company behind it, Microsoft are fighting back by owning more and more exclusive rights. The question many players want to know now, though, is will they restrict their rivals' access to these major titles? Like many of the games themselves, tech companies are fighting their own battles, but for content. And gaming is fast becoming the most lucrative market in entertainment. Stefan Powell, BBC News.
The time is very nearly 6:20, our top story this evening. The Prime Minister has denied categorically that he was warned a garden party in Downing Street during lockdown was against the rules. And still to come, do not feed the birds. The latest avian flu outbreak has seen 26 swans culled in Windsor. We'll have the latest.
Coming up in Sports Day on the BBC News Channel, new names in the picture for England as they name their squad for the Six Nations, and a new captain at the helm for Wales ahead of the tournament which starts next month.
Job vacancies in the UK soared to a record high of more than 1.2 million between October and December. The new figures from the Office for National Statistics are the first to exclude the impact of the government's furlough scheme, which ended in September. But the figures also show that average pay rises are failing to keep up with the increase in the cost of living. Our economics editor Faisal Islam has more.
Another month where the jobs figures show a record number of vacancies as the economy recovers from COVID and unemployment falls to the levels at the start of the pandemic. But on the streets of the likes of Eastbourne, the flip side of that, bins uncollected as strikes among drivers and collectors spread from other towns.
You should be respected, you should be well paid, and you should have decent facilities.
At a picket at the depot, the drivers have turned down a rise of 7% offered by the local council-owned waste company, demanding a rise of 20%.
7% of a low hourly rate is a low percentage. That's why we're saying, forget that, let's get to £13.50. That's a market rate going right now. Recognise that and pay what they're worth.
And when you say the market rate, that's because there's a shortage of HGV drivers elsewhere in the commercial sector.
Yes, it is as simple as that.
Eastbourne is well known for its retired residents, and today's figures showed a new post-pandemic factor shrinking the British workforce. The British jobs market has performed well, defying the expectations of the depth of the pandemic, especially so since the end of the furlough scheme in the autumn. Unemployment has remained low, but there's now a separate crisis, a shortage of workers caused not just by a lack of European labour, but also the fact that many older workers have not gone back to work since the pandemic. At the Eastbourne allotments, Jill, a dietitian, is one of hundreds of thousands of workers across the country who've permanently left the workforce earlier than expected over the past 2 years.
Don't get me wrong, I like my job and I consider myself lucky to work. But I've moved to a different phase of my life. It's earlier than I expected.
We'll stand with you and we're going to win it.
This afternoon, the refuse collectors who had been on strike pronounced victory. A pay rise of 11% agreed by the council. The union predicts these demands will spread elsewhere.
What we've seen in the last couple of years is effectively labour become a seller's market. There's over 1 million vacancies in the country. We're seeing huge areas like social care, HGV drivers, gas fitters. There are shortages. And I think employers need to understand this. And it's simply not acceptable that people are expected to see a cut in their living while performing an essential service.
Today's figures show across the economy pay is increasing less than prices. Wage hikes are for now limited to sectors with shortages. Where that goes is the big unknown of the recovery. Faisal Islam, BBC News in Eastbourne.
A man has gone on trial accused of killing a 6-year-old boy in Peterborough more than 25 years ago. James Watson, who is 40 now, would have been 13 at the time that Ricky Neve disappeared in 1994. The Old Bailey was told he had been exhibiting a grotesque interest in the subject of child murder. Joe Black reports.
Ricky Neve was only 6 when he was murdered 27 years ago. He left home for school on the Welland estate in Peterborough, but never returned. The following day, his naked body was discovered in Woodland, a place familiar to children in the area. The court was told that Ricky had most likely been strangled and that the killer had deliberately laid his body out in a star shape. There was no sign of his clothing, but nearby on a leaf was a single small white shirt button. The next day, his school uniform was discovered in a wheelie bin nearby. Small toys and cards still in his pockets. 6 months later, Ruth Neve, Ricky's mother, was accused of his murder. She was unanimously cleared by a jury, but was jailed after admitting cruelty charges. The court was told Ricky was well known on the estate, but was a vulnerable child, used by his mother to collect drugs, and this neglect exposed him to great risk. 27 years later, James Watson is now accused of the little boy's murder. In 2015, a new investigation was opened using techniques not available in the mid-90s. Scientific examination of adhesive tapings from Ricky's clothes were examined, and a DNA match to James Watson was allegedly made. James Watson would have been 13 years old at the time of Ricky's death, and the court was told he'd been seen with Ricky on the morning of the 28th of November 1994. The court heard his teachers told police at the time he had a conspicuous preoccupation with Ricky Neve's death. James Watson denies murder, and the case is expected to last 8 weeks. Joe Black, BBC News.
Well, let's take a look at some of today's other news now. And a government contract given to a firm whose founders were friends of Dominic Cummings has been ruled lawful, overturning an earlier court judgment. Last year, the High Court ruled that the £550,000 contract awarded to PR firm Public First was unlawful. The campaign group The Good Law Project says it plans to appeal. The 10 biggest US airlines have warned that the impending switch-on of 5G mobile phone services will disrupt planes' navigation systems, particularly those used in bad weather. The airlines want 5G signals to be excluded from around 2 miles near affected airports. The BBC understands negotiations are continuing at the highest levels of the US government. A 56-year-old from Cumbria has pleaded guilty to a modern slavery offence after a vulnerable man told police he had been living in a shed for 40 years. The Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority say they have never witnessed such a traumatic case. Fiona Trott reports.
It's impossible to imagine, but for 40 years this is where someone lived. Not a home, but a cell, with no heat and no light. On the floor where he slept, a soiled duvet to keep him warm, a place where he rested after working on farms for as little as £10 a day. As for his food and drink, there's some evidence here of what that was like.
His condition has improved, physically he's much healthier. However, it's got to be said that he's still very traumatised from what he's suffered over the last 40 years. He will never lead a totally independent life.
Today, 56-year-old Peter Swales pleaded guilty to conspiring to facilitate travel of another with a view to exploitation. He's due to be sentenced next month. As for the victim who was forced to live like this, he's now in supported accommodation outside Cumbria. No longer a victim, but still recovering after being treated so cruelly for 4 decades. He will need care for the rest of his life. Fiona Trott, BBC News.
26 swans have been culled in Berkshire as an outbreak of bird flu spreads across England. Bird flu, or avian flu, is an infectious type of influenza that spreads among birds. In rare cases, it can affect humans too. More than 2 million birds have been culled as a result of the ongoing outbreak. Claire Marshall reports.
The surviving Windsor swans today, now living in an exclusion zone. More than 24 have had to be killed after being infected with avian flu. Some of them were being cared for at this bird sanctuary in Eton. The entire flock had to be destroyed.
Some of the birds have been with us for 6 months. They're coming either sick or injured. They've been in intensive care. We'd nursed them back. It's all about getting them ready for a release. So to do this was appalling.
Head north and the virus is wreaking havoc on a much larger scale. These pictures were filmed by an RSPB officer on the Solway coast in southwest Scotland. The charity initially estimated 4,000 barnacle geese were wiped out. Now they believe it could be double that, which would make it a quarter of the world's population.
It's really quite serious for wild birds, and that is unprecedented in the UK. Really, we have population level impacts on the Svalbard breeding barnacle goose population. And that is a real cause for concern, and it's new territory for us, so we don't really know where this is going to go at this stage.
This is what an infected bird looks like. The H5N1 virus affects the nervous system. The creature loses coordination and eventually dies. This is the kind of place where wild birds love to come and rest. It's not just wild populations that are affected, it's caged and penned birds too. There are around 80 premises that have been affected in the UK so far. Last year, there was just 26. And so far, around 2 million birds have had to be destroyed. While the disease, a strain of coronavirus, can be eradicated in individual sites, migratory birds carrying it are continuing to arrive from Russia and Eastern Europe. Alan Gosling from Devon is the first person to be infected with bird flu. It's very rare, but it shows the need to take it very seriously.
You don't want the virus to change. You don't want it to give it the opportunity to change. And that's one of the reasons that we go in and we cull out birds, both to stop it spreading and infecting and killing more birds, but also to stop the virus having more time to change.
The heating climate is altering the migration patterns of birds. The fear is that this is helping the virus to spread. Claire Marshall, BBC News in the Cotswolds.
Britain's Emma Raducanu has made a winning start at her first Australian Open by beating the former US Open champion Sloane Stephens in 3 sets. In fact, it was a bumper day for the Brits in Melbourne, as Joe Wilson reports.
Just after 10 p.m. in the Melbourne evening, stepped forward the US Open champion. Could Emma Raducanu relocate that level of play? Well, look, the power, speed and touch all on show. First set 6-love. So good. Her opponent was Sloane Stephens, who once won the US Open herself. Far too good to be overwhelmed.
Yeah, well done.
How would Raducanu respond?
Brilliant way to finish.
She won the 3rd set 6-1. The bigger the occasion, the better her performance. Already, incredibly, it's what we've come to expect from her. And it's still what we see from Andy Murray. He was on court against a familiar opponent who's never predictable. Nicolas Basilashvili can hit the ball anywhere.
Oh.
In the first set, he was at his worst. In the second, the Georgian found his best form. Intense tennis. Murray's pivotal points often came from his opponent's forced errors.
The longest game of the match. The biggest game of the match.
Yeah, but in the 4th set, Basilashvili, seeded 21, was perfect in the tiebreak. Murray driven to frustration. What would he have left? Well, loads, actually. In the 5th set, Murray took back control. Match point, yet another rigorous rally. And another victory.
The quality, the desire.
On the very court where 3 years ago we thought he'd retired. Truly, this is bonus time. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
Time now for a look at the weather with Ben Rich. Hello.
Hi there, Sophie. Thank you. Very good evening to you. After what was a cold start for many this morning, temperatures recovered quite nicely, particularly where we had some brightness. However, a few clung on to fog all day long. That was Essex earlier on, and that really pegged the temperatures back. And I think fog will continue to be a problem for some southeastern parts of England as we go through tonight. Further north and west, well, things are moving a little bit more. The air turning over, so there won't be fog. There'll be cloud. There'll be outbreaks of rain, and there'll be quite a brisk breeze as well. In fact, quite windy weather in northern Scotland. But with the mix of low cloud and fog and a strong wind, it'll probably stay frost-free for most. Frontal systems pushing southwards tomorrow, bringing some showery rain. And behind those various weather fronts, well, a cold northwesterly wind starts to kick in. You will feel the chill in that wind. So those weather fronts, particularly this band of cloud and patchy rain, sinking southeastwards across England and Wales through the morning. Behind that, some spells of sunshine, some showers blowing in on that northwesterly wind. Some of those showers wintry, even to quite low levels in the far north, just 1 degree in Lerwick through the middle of the afternoon. And elsewhere, those temperatures tending to come down as the day wears on. Now for Thursday, a cold start, a frosty start for many. We'll see showers for eastern coasts, 1 or 2 for West Wales, the far southwest of England. For most, a beautiful sunny winter's day, but a cold one, highs between 4 and 8 degrees. Now then, as we head towards the end of the week, well, high pressure re-establishes itself close to the centre of that high in southern parts of the UK. I think it'll stay quite chilly with frost and fog continuing to cause problems. Further north, more of a breeze, that breeze coming from the Atlantic, so it will start to turn a bit milder here. The highest temperatures likely to be across parts of Scotland towards the end of the week, staying a little bit chillier further south. Sophie.
Ben, thank you. And our main story tonight, the Prime Minister has denied categorically claims by his former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, that he was warned a garden party in Downing Street during lockdown was against the rules. Tonight, the BBC has been told the team led by civil servant Sue Gray have approached Dominic Cummings regarding her inquiry into Downing Street parties. That's it from us. Goodbye.